I just wanted to briefly introduce this project that was delivered by the Deveron, Bug and Isles Rivers Trust and District Salmon Fishery Board. I'm just going to give the first slide. The project really came about after Matt Newton presented to Raft's conference a couple of years back on his PhD work that he did on Loch Farrell in Ireland and showed the mortality there of smolts. And following a couple of years of poor rod and line catches on the Deveron, the board and the trust were keen to initiate their own project to look at smolt mortality in the river and just out into the sea. So they came up with we worked on a plan for a project. We're very lucky to be able to collaborate with Matt at Glasgow and the group at SEAM there. So we designed a project that we could look at mortality from a smolt trap that was running for a monitoring project, monitoring a wind farm in the upper catchment. So we're going to track smolts right down through the river and then hopefully a little bit out into the sea. As you can see from the mouth of the river here, where it enters the Moray Firth, there's not a huge potential without having a lot of receivers to pick them up at sea. So we just literally tracked them out into the bay just to see how survival was out into the initial bay. And we were very fortunate that Angus Lothian did the analysis and wrote up this project as part of his master's. So I'll hand over to him as he did all the real grunt work and working through the project. Thanks.
Cheers. Thank you, Marcus, and thank you, Ken, for the introduction as well. So the main aims of this study were obviously, as Marcus was saying, to quantify, well, my aims when I was analysing the data was to quantify the early marine speed, mortality, and the direction into the bay, and from that extrapolate an idea of where they might be heading out in the North Sea, and then to also look at and add information to the river mortality and speed. So the study site, as Marcus said, River Deveron, and it's a 96-kilometre river and has a catchment of 1,224 square kilometres. It's quite a large catchment area. It flows through or from the Moray, county of Moray, into Aberdeenshire and out and directly into the Moray Firth. It's very similar to the River Bush in that it has little to no estuary, and it's not as extensive as the River Bush, but it does flow over a beach into the Moray Firth itself. The bay at Banff, so here, is approximately 1.3 kilometres wide and is a max depth of 8 metres. So we had quite an extensive receiver network throughout the river. It was 12 receivers, 9 in the river and 5 in the bay. That doesn't add up, that's 14 receivers. There was a combination of just regular VR2 and VR2 TX receivers. The TX receivers are important because they've got built-in transmitters, and they can also record sound, temperature, and tilt, and such forth. And so you can do some interesting stuff with that, so we'll move on to that later. But yeah, so receivers were placed in the river, attached to these concrete tires in deep, slow-moving sections of the river to reduce the noise. Noise is a big factor when talking about acoustic telemetry. And in the bay, we had a curtain of 5 receivers to enhance our chances of detecting smolts and to try and get that trajectory from the river. And the bay receivers were anchored with this heavy weight with a subsurface buoy. So then we captured 50 smolts across 3 days. The smolts that we tagged, well, we caught more than 50, but we tagged 50. The ones we tagged were greater than 120 millimeters, which is reasonably small when talking about acoustically tagging salmon smolts. But in this study, that's all that we had available, really. So we anesthetized them and we implanted a 7mm Telma Biotel acoustic tag into them and sutured up with 2 independent stitches. And yeah, the fish were left to recover until they were fully, until they'd come around from the anesthetic. They were left in the back of the trap. Oh, sorry, back of the trap here, just underneath the riffle. Lots of oxygenated water. Released several hours after tagging. when talking about acoustic telemetry, it's really important to understand that there's lots of noise in the environment, and so this can often block the transmissions from the tags being detected. And so we did range tests to ensure that we were getting full detections. And so we did this in the river by doing a retrospective range test by simply dividing the number of fish on downstream receivers by the number of fish on upstream. Other way around. It was basically upstream on top, downstream on bottom. And so this would give you a test of how many fish you missed on your upstream receivers. In the marine, we turned on the transmitter in the TX receivers, and this emitted a constant range test throughout the study period from the 9th of May to the 29th of May, which was the period in which the smolts were migrating through the bay. So yeah, these tags were emitting every 90 seconds just to get this continuous noise and background data. I'll run through this very quickly because it's quite boring, but we did a whole bunch of statistical tests. We ran some mixed models and some regular linear models to try and basically explain what the river speed, what was influencing the river speed, but also what was affecting the passage. So what variables would influence passage success. We used a binary model there. And then we'd also wanted to look at if there was any factors that influenced the vector of travel in the marine environment, so i.e. which receiver in the bay fish were detected on first. So to start off with the results, we had to remove 4 receivers from the data analyses because these have particularly poor efficiencies. The first 2 receivers had efficiencies of 17 and 2.8%, really low. We missed 30 fish on these receivers. So D3 here was considered our most efficient receiver, and therefore was then the first receiver that we took all the information from. D5 and D9 here was also similarly low. D9 not particularly low, it was a 90%, but we figured if it wasn't 100, we might as well not use it. So that left us with 5 receivers in the river to use in the analyses. The range test in the bay was interesting. We discovered that there was lots of drops, or not lots, but a few drops in detection efficiencies, were possibly coinciding with high levels of rain, lots of noise entering the bay. But these were in periods where no smolts were in the immediate vicinity, and so we're fairly confident that we didn't miss any smolts on the bay receivers. As you can see, it was almost continuously at about 90% or above, so which is quite good to have. The receivers were 100 meters apart, with about 100 meter range, so 100 meter radius range. So all of the signals were overlapping. So as well, if one did miss, then we're fairly confident another receiver would have picked up the fish anyway. Something that many people do skim across, but we've wanted to state, we did tag small fish, and as a result, the tag burden was quite a bit higher than what was normally deemed acceptable with this 2% rule. But when looking at differences, comparing those that died in the river and those that were successful in leaving the river, there was no significant difference between the tag burden between them. So we can say to some degree that there was no immediate observable cause of mortality through the tagging. But obviously 14% of the fish length is really quite high. Yeah. But saying that, we had 40% survival from the river, which is considerably lower than we were expecting. Of the 50 fish, 20 of them made it to the end of the river on D8. We had a mortality rate of 0.77% a kilometer. in the model, there was no variables predicted the passage. So we think it is primarily due to predation, but I'll get onto that in a second. In the marine environment, we had 100% survival rate. All 20 smolts left and migrated from the end of the river out into the Moray Firth, which was significantly better than 60% mortality in the river. So yeah, as I said before, the river mortality, it was within the range of other studies, but still quite a bit higher than we wanted. No environmental variables could explain it, and we're kind of saying that it was potentially the predation due to soil bills on the river or the big trout that the Deveron are famous for. Unlike other studies, however, we had 0% mortality in the marine environment. This is possibly due to the speed that they were traveling through, and I'll get onto that in a second. But there's also potentially the lack of predators and also the very small monitoring period. We only monitored them for about 1 kilometer in the marine environment, so you can't really extrapolate huge bits of huge information from that. The migration speed in the river was significant between the two groups of successful and unsuccessful smolts. It took on average 18 days for the fish to leave the release site to get to, I think it was 80 kilometers downstream to the bay, which is quite fast. However, fish did take some fish took 40 days, some fish took a week. But on average, it was 18 days. Yeah, fish moved quite a lot faster. Those that were successful moved quite a lot faster, and when modeling this, we found that it was particularly due to river height that was influencing the speed, and also the lunar brightness. When days or nights of brighter light, a more intense moon, smolts were moving faster as well. In the marine environment, there was a huge difference between the migration speeds. And so from the 5 kilometers a day in the river, they've jumped up to 37 kilometers a day in the marine environment, which is quite a lot more significant increase in speed. Smolts were detected in the bay from the 29th of April until the 29th of May. The speed in the marine environment in the bay was almost significantly due to the river height. So the swim speeds in the river were quite a bit slower than, or on the lower end of the reported values in the literature. And as I said before, it was heavily dependent on the river discharge and the lunar brightness. One thing that we didn't take into consideration in the analyses was cloud cover at night, and so it could just be a coincidence that on those very bright nights when you had greater speed, it was also very cloudy. It is Scotland, it is not unreasonable to think that. But in the marine environment, the speeds were very similar to those reported by other studies. It could be a predation avoidance behavior where they fire out into the Moray Firth as quick as possible to avoid the predation. It could also be that they're making use of a freshwater plume, which was linked to the increase in the river height. Upon marine entry, significantly more fish were detected at 7.5 and 8.5 degrees Celsius, which is at the lower end of the temperatures of what some other studies have reported. There's obviously greater smolt entry at night, but lunar brightness did not influence the entry times into the marine environment. Interestingly, more fish were detected on a rising tide than an ebbing tide, which was contradictory to what Andy was saying yesterday on the River Tyne and to the River Froome. When smolts were leaving the river and migrating into the bay, there was no clear single vector of travel. They were detected on all of the receivers in the bay, but they were generally clustered on the 2 westerly receivers here. The median travel vector is north-northeasterly, but once in the bay, they all did hang around B4 after our initial detections. Significantly more detections were found on this receiver here. So during residency in the bay itself, that's where they hang out. Yeah, as we said before, they entered at lower temperatures. Don't know if that is a response to climate change, or if that's more of if that's their optimal window, as we kept saying yesterday, for the Deveron fish. As expected, we got the nocturnal entry into the marine environment, but we still are trying to figure out why fish were entering on a rising tide rather than an ebbing tide. It makes sense for them to be pulled out on an ebbing tide. As it is very similar to the river Bush, and the river does flow very low over a beach, it could just be that the rising tide gives them the elevation to avoid predation, and also just calms the water down, and it's not so riffly. The trajectory was north-northeasterly, which is also the direction of the North Sea, so it's in line with that. But as we say, it's only a kilometre detection, so we can't say for certain if that was the line they followed further on. So to summarize, we wanted to increase the current knowledge of wild Atlantic salmon smolts using acoustic telemetry, and I feel like we did add to that knowledge here. We observed a greater speed of migration in the marine environment than in the river, which we didn't expect, and we also observed a greater mortality in the greater mortality in the river than in the marine environment, which is, again, we didn't expect. I have said here that this is the first description of coastal migration in Scotland. That's possibly a bit naive, but it stands true today because Matt, Lorraine, and Neil haven't talked yet. I'll pass you on to Marcus quickly.
So very briefly, following the results in the river, the District Salmon Fishery Board and the Trust were pretty keen to investigate that 60% mortality that was found through the length of the river. So we're continuing this project this year. Very grateful for some financial support from the Atlantic Salmon Trust and the project going forward this year. We're going to tag another 40 smolts from the same smolt trap that's operating up in the upper catchment, using radio telemetry equipment this year. So hopefully we'll be able to track down those tag losses and find out where exactly in the river and possibly by what causes we're losing those smolts. And to see if we can repeat the findings, are we going to get 60% again, or is it going to be a completely different? I was very keen that we didn't just stop after 1 year. It was an interesting study, but 1 year really is just one tiny little dot in the ocean. So hopefully carrying on this year, we'll get a bit more information and we'll be able to delve down into that 60% mortality that we found in the river. Thank you. And thank you to Angus.